Hi, friends. As you may know by now, the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast is turning 5 years old pretty soon.
5 years.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe that we launched our very first episode way back in April 2021.
Yeah.
To celebrate this milestone, we're diving deep into the archives to relaunch 5 of our favorite episodes, the ones that have truly resonated with us as educators and as people.
For today's relaunch, we're revisiting a conversation from our third year, 2023, that feels more relevant every day: global citizenship.
We were so lucky to be joined by Brantley Turner, who is the East Asia Education Director for the Dwight Schools and the founding head of school of Dwight School Hanoi. Having lived outside the US for the better part of 30 years, her perspective on what it means to be a global citizen is incredibly profound.
In this episode, we examine how we can help our students open their minds and sit with the paradoxes of a globalized world.
There are a few key pillars that we explore in this conversation. Here's a little teaser, starting with the idea that global citizenship isn't an abstract ideal. Brantley challenges us to start with the local constraints we have and ask, how much can you impact locally?
We also dive into the travel bug versus true global engagement. It's not just about where you've been, right? It's about having the tools to decode and digest the information flying at us.
And that leads to a critical point on media literacy. We've been talking about that a lot lately.
Yeah, it's our favorite. Yeah.
Yeah. It's so important. Brantley shares a powerful warning about the negative side of globalism. That's the manipulation of points of view and the spread of misinformation. Teaching students to decode these messages is a vital part of global citizenship instruction.
And of course, we look at practical ways. No episode would be complete without some kind of practical takeaway to bring these heavy concepts into the classroom, like using role plays, for example, to help students navigate unfamiliar concepts and develop real world accuracy.
This episode is a call to move past superficial global lessons towards an education that truly prepares young people for the world. We hope you find it as stimulating as we did.
But first, a word about our sponsors.
This episode is sponsored by Ellie.
Ellie is one of the world's leading online content providers for English teachers.
If you're looking for relevant, ready-made materials to get your students talking, head over to ellie.com today.
That's ELLII.com.
You've always got to start with an understanding the constraints that you're dealing with, right? So people like to ask questions like, what's the ideal school? And I think that ideal school question is, how much can you impact locally?
Hi, listeners.
Hi.
That was an excerpt from our guest today, Brantley Turner, on the topic of teaching global citizenship.
One of our favorite topics. Needless to say, we were pretty psyched to plunge headfirst into this topic.
And our conversation with Brantley turned out to be so stimulating. I think we've come away as better teachers and just better people.
Yeah. So join us, listeners, and plunge with us into global citizenship, what it means in education, why it's important, and how to teach it in a respectful, enriching way. Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud Podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Anna.
And I'm Shey.
And this is Brantley.
Brantley Turner, she, her. I am the East Asia Education Director for the Dwight Schools. Maybe more interestingly, I am American, but have spent the greater part of the last 30 years living outside the US. So mainly in mainland China, and at the moment on my way to a move to Hanoi, Vietnam.
Great.
I think we've all got that travel bug. So since you are such a globetrotter, and I'm sure you've been on a lot of really long flights all around the world, could you tell us what is one essential item that you always bring with you on a long flight? And I don't mean your phone or your laptop, the thing that everyone brings. What's one thing that you have to bring with you on a long flight or you feel kind of lost?
So the thing I regret not having if I don't bring it is an eye mask, which is a very standard item, but it's one of those things where when you really need to sleep, that becomes a critical piece of travel gear.
Yeah, I completely relate to that because I've forgotten my eye mask before as well. And then you have to cover your head with a scarf and whatever you can do. Yeah, whatever you have.
I will say I was speaking with my very close colleague from Dwight, the Global Education Director, head of Dwight School in New York last night. And we were reminiscing about stories about when our kids used to barf on us on long flights.
Fun.
She reminded me that I told her after the fact of a bad flight she had to Shanghai with her 2-year-old at the time that, yes, bringing an extra pair of clothes when traveling with a small child, 27 hours on a plane is also a good tip.
Yeah, and your carry-on, it's essential. That's something you really build up over time of knowing that you need that extra set of clothes for whatever happens when you're in the air, when you land, whether it's your kid or yourself. Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Right. Thank you for playing along. And so let's dive right in. Tell us, Brantley, how you founded Dwight Schools and how this school fulfills a need in the community. Right now, you're in Hanoi, Vietnam, founding a new Dwight School. So give us some context on the Chinese educational system you originally found yourself in, and maybe some perspectives on how that process is going in Hanoi.
Absolutely. So the Dwight School's original school is Dwight School New York. And actually just this past year, we celebrated the 150th anniversary of Dwight School in New York. Yeah, pretty crazy. I guess you could kind of think of it as headquarters, although, of course, every school has its own unique individual context. Where my story segues with the Dwight story is in 2008, I started bringing students from Dwight School New York to China for experiential education programs. And that developed into a program that we ran in Beijing for 6 years with Chinese national students in high school in Beijing. And from that, it's a long and winding tale, but wound up having this opportunity to found a school called Shanghai Qibao Dwight High School, which is Dwight School in China, in Shanghai. And it is the only Sino-US independent cooperatively run high school in mainland China approved by the Ministry of Education. So I think in a nutshell, the kind of way to think about it is at the Dwight Schools, there's 7 schools globally, but we have very much a kind of global vision, but local practice. So our schools in each country feel very different, look very different, student population is very different. And so when I think about serving the community, it's so important to honor the local context, but to work within the framework of the local context and still try to do things that are pretty out of the box. So certainly running the school in China, starting the school in China was reading the tea leaves, understanding the local context to even be able to get open. It was really important to Dwight that we start a school in China that could educate Chinese nationals because it's a highly restricted educational landscape. So again, I think, and that kind of gets to your question around, what are you trying to do in your community? And we were really trying to be an educational option for local students that they would not otherwise have.
Love that local to global perspective. That's fantastic.
What a breath of fresh air. The way Brantley places an understanding of local needs before all else. I couldn't agree more.
Same. It's so easy to just impose what we think is correct, or as Brantley said, the ideal school. But one size does not fit all.
Yeah, there's been enough of that worldwide, right? And I think it's really easy to slip into that fallacy, that belief that our way is the right way. But I guess the question from there becomes, well, how do you implement this local to global perspective at the curriculum and classroom level?
Curriculum is obviously an important starting point, and the Dwight Schools around the world are international baccalaureate schools. Wherever we go, we do work to become authorized to teach the IB, and the IB mission, the IB statements around international mindedness, they're just a great toolkit for how we need to be thinking about the mission, vision, and values of the school. To look up the IB, right, if you look at International Baccalaureate, you're going to find that it was a curriculum originally developed in Geneva to serve multiple purposes. It was about rebuilding the world and Europe post-World War II, and thinking about how important it was to keep another world war of that nature from starting, increasing mutual understanding, increasing mutual respect, and then also serving children who moved from country to country, potentially in diplomatic families, and needed to have that continuum of instruction and learning that wasn't disrupted as their families moved, every 2 years, every 3 years. So it grows out of those two things, providing opportunities for families that moved, and also looking to really help people with differences understand that different points of view can also be right, and that we need to learn how to respect those different points of view. It's a very holistic curriculum, and it's very, very rigorous. So it's certainly not for all students, although there are pathways to access the IB as a non-full diploma student. But it's really geared towards pre-university college preparation. I would say the second component of that, and something that the IB really values, has been valuing mother tongue language. So that when we talk about international curriculum moving into, in my region, Asia, it's very important that internationalization of the curriculum isn't the westernization. And even though the IB started in the West, and it is available in English, French, or Spanish as its primary languages, the IB places a really heavy emphasis on mother tongue. So if you are a Chinese national student, you are very likely taking mother tongue Chinese language or literature, or both mother tongue Chinese and English, right, if you're achieving at that level. But you can be a Chinese national student and take mother tongue Chinese and take language acquisition English. You're not forced into English as your second mother tongue language. So you can honor that heritage language. And so that's critical, because I think that ensuring that when we're educating students with an internationally accessed curriculum, that we're not requiring them to abandon their heritage, particularly through their language.
That's great. We talk a lot on this podcast about, because as English teachers, we're thinking about this all the time, right? The fact that we are going into a space and just having some assumptions about, you need to know English because XYZ reasons. Well, there's a big colonial history in there, and there's a lot to consider in how you approach that.
Interesting. I've referred to the IB in developing courses about global citizenship and had students over the years coming from IB programs, but I've never taught in an IB program personally.
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear about it from Brantley. And actually, she shared a lot more with us than what we ended up keeping in this episode for the sake of time. But she went into how it's structured into primary years, middle years, and diploma program, and how there are 6 groups or subject areas learners study throughout, and all of the levels of assessment required for it. As she said, it's rigorous.
Rigorous, yes. But really, the essence of the IB curriculum, this focus on mutual understanding and also placing value on learners' mother tongues, that really embodies what we want in an international schools or in the English language classroom more generally.
Not to mention, these values fundamentally embody what it means to be a global citizen.
Well then, let's define that.
Context. So how would you explain what it means to be a global citizen?
I think just generally what we're aiming for with trying to develop young people is tolerance and acceptance and an inclusive mindset, and really recognizing that there's value in knowing people that you wholeheartedly agree with or wholeheartedly disagree with. And I think a lot of being a global citizen is uncomfortable. So aside from inclusivity, I would say also being able to sort of handle that paradox of discomfort when you're faced with it. And through that, you grow resilience. I definitely take pause with the idea that you must be moving around the world to be a global citizen. And my own personal definition of global citizenship has changed when I think how much you see a globally minded person, a person who cares about the world outside of themselves or has enough self-awareness to position themselves in a greater picture. And you don't need to leave your hometown, whatever that might be, to have that perspective. So I'm really loving the idea these days of thinking how valuable lessons in global citizenship are for us just in our own backyards.
I love that. That's a great quote. I think we need to plaster that everywhere, that global citizenship can happen in our own backyards. I love the definition that you just gave. Yeah.
And, something that really resonated with me was, this idea that you don't have to be a world traveler to be a global citizen. A few years ago at Fordham University in New York, I taught an Introduction to Global Citizenship course. And within the course, I had both international and domestic students. And, the domestic students had very limited experience traveling abroad. And so one of the very first questions they asked me was, well, Shey, I haven't been out of the country much, so how can I be a global citizen? And so I think that that's a really important question and a lesson for, both teachers, students, individuals in general, that we don't have to be globetrotters to be aware of what's going on outside of our little bubble and develop empathy and consideration for people who grow up in different cultural environments than we do. So I'm glad that you highlighted that. Did you want to say something?
I was just going to say, I think you've hit the nail on the head with the empathy piece, right? Can you walk in others' shoes? And the other thing too is, can you cooperate? Because if we take it to the kind of macro level, the challenges that are facing the world, the biggest challenges facing the world are global and require cooperation. So when we talk about poverty, climate change, pandemics, global health, it is borderless. So we must have a globally focused mindset if we're going to tackle the biggest challenges facing humankind. But at the same time, we don't want to position, when we talk about this global-minded piece, that you must have the privilege of, right, the travel, the access. Yeah. In any experience, let's say you're on the subway in New York and somebody's rude or you have an encounter that's uncomfortable. I always try to think, like, what's that person going through today? Like, what's happened to them that has put them in this situation? Can I step outside myself? Can I try to, you can't always walk in somebody else's shoes, but can you at least care enough to, for a moment, not make everything about yourself? And I think that's been something I've been asked so many questions in the Asia context in which I've lived that I'm like, really? Like, somebody's asking me that? And then I think, but wait a second, where are they coming from that is what they want to access about me, that they want to understand about me? And can I just not make this about myself for a minute and try to understand more where that question is coming from? And I think the same thing in the classroom. We have to be able to ask questions that we can't guarantee how the other people in the room might feel about them. If we don't keep asking and trying to understand what's going on, we shut ourselves off to that learning. And that definitely freaks me out a little bit about the US. That censorship process, right? Somebody would listen to your podcast and think, oh my gosh, this person spent 24 years in China, like censorship and all those challenges and lack of freedom of speech. But absolutely, I'm not going to advocate against that. But at the same time, I see those threads in our own US context. And they frighten me because I see the slippery slope of losing the ability to have open dialogue. We shouldn't take it for granted. I guess that's my only point.
Wow. Shey, there's so much in what Brantley said right there that I want to just pause and reflect on. So many great quotes for us to put in our back pockets.
Or frame on a wall, really. Global citizenship can happen in our backyard.
And I also really like this one. Being a global citizen is uncomfortable.
Let that simmer there for a minute.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. And I appreciated that Brantley didn't shy away from a slightly more political statement. People in the US can be so judgmental about censorship laws in China, but we'll often say, oh, that would never happen here. But Brantley pointed out that this is a slippery slope.
Yeah, that American exceptionalism, except we're just as prone to it. We need to be careful of the insidious censorship that often occurs under the guise of free speech.
And she mentioned that merely as an example of how closing ourselves off to others' perspectives through censorship, but also more subtly, that really isn't very conducive to developing global dialogue.
Right. It's all about perspective taking, listeners. This whole conversation really made me think of our conversations in our 2 episodes on media literacy, Media Literacy 101 and 102.
And also the conversations we've had on empathy building. Most recently in our episode on storytelling, episode 43, with Dustin from Sandman Stories Presents.
And to go back to that first quote you mentioned, Shey, global citizenship can happen in our backyard. Through this quote, Brantley pointed out that global citizenship doesn't really depend on whether a person has the privilege to travel. And that spurred another branch of our conversation.
You know, what happens when you're working with students who are coming from underprivileged or just extremely, low income, poverty riddled environments, and they don't necessarily have the bandwidth to think globally or attempt to collaborate with others who are in other places in the world to sort of combat these larger issues we're all facing collectively. Could you speak to what we might say to convince students that this really is something that they can pay attention to?
I think so. So a lot of my, just to like contextualize my own experience, a lot of my experience working with populations with less access in general to resources and education has been outside of the U.S. So in my experience teaching in more rural parts of China has been much more informed by just opening the vision to the possible. For those kids. And often the students that I have interacted with more in remote parts of China are younger students, so more primary school than high school. Partially that's due to the phenomenon of a lot of villages in China. You only find the very young and the very old. There's a huge amount of migration for work and migration for continuing with secondary education or going into vocational education. So you often are in villages where there are not a lot of teenagers or, folks under the age of 60. And so I think it's about joy and it's about curiosity and it's about inspiring kids to something beyond the scope of what they've seen. And so for my practice has always just been to try to be joyful and to play. And none of that is directly addressing potentially large challenges or expecting those students to be thinking in these grand ways, but just to give them the idea of hope, that there is another pathway, that they are seen, that they are cared for, feeling like there's always something to strive for or a next place to go or a next adventure, even if, it might not look the same to everyone what that adventure is, but kind of validating for them what they feel excited about.
Amazing. Yeah. I love that you said opening the vision to the possible. And I think it's something that is, a really solid takeaway for any of our listeners, no matter their education context. There is always opportunity to expand your students' thinking and your own thinking. It doesn't necessarily have to look like a recycling drive or something tangible moving towards, bettering the world or the community. It can just be as seemingly minute as starting with oneself and one's own mentality.
Yeah. I love that throughout this, you're talking about making space for that. Holding that space for that curiosity and that joy, because different people have the different ability to stop and engage in that curiosity. So I like that you're creating the space that maybe not everyone has created for themselves or has the means to create for themselves because of whatever situation they're in. So,
and I also think like the framing of it as like making space for joy and possibility. I think when we think about, the challenges that we all face on a global level, like it's really distressing, right? And it's easy to get bogged down with negative thought cycles and rumination. So I think that like starting with that place of joy and exploration, curiosity is really key.
And Brantley, you were going to jump in. Yeah.
When students ask me or they say, oh, but you did this and Miss Turner, well, that's different and I can't do that. And I just always say, look, start by saying yes. I've had every odd job, in Beijing. I used to get asked like pass out flyers at an exhibition center, show up for some random phone, thing that I couldn't even necessarily understand exactly what I was being asked to do for a weekend, volunteer session. And you can second guess so much and become so self-conscious about how other people view what you're doing. I was walking through these lanes I'm in Vietnam right now, in Hanoi, which is in the north of Vietnam, and it's been really wet. And I was walking through these lanes between where I'm working and the hotel I'm staying, and I was kind of like holding my pants up this evening. And I shoot a really muddy, and I just had this moment feeling of how intimidated and how shy and how uncomfortable I would have felt 30 years ago. and just thinking, I couldn't have done this. And I all of a sudden had this kind of moment of like, oh my God, this is wild. Like, I feel so at home. I don't speak any Vietnamese. I've spent very little time in Vietnam. I'm learning as I go. And I had this moment of like, wow, I've come a long way. So again, like saying yes to stuff, pushing yourself, pushing your comfort zone, pushing your limits, whatever they are, everybody's are different. The only other thing that I would add to that is that the beauty of that kind of global citizen piece or getting outside of yourself is, you know, leaving the shame of like your own culture behind and kind of allowing yourself to be like the laughed at giant lady with the muddy pants, like in a lane where, you know, I couldn't control, no ability to control how anybody would perceive me or think about me. And that's very liberating.
Yeah, amazing. I'm envious. I'm just wondering, Brantley, how do I get to do what you do?
Brantley is just doing such fascinating things. That comfort with being uncomfortable, that's the dream.
It is, yeah. Being comfortable with being an outsider to a culture and not fully understanding the social norms or language, and being humble enough to embrace our potential missteps. For some, that might come naturally, but it is definitely something we can practice.
Yeah, it's an important part of global citizenship, I think. And it kind of reflects the whole process of language learning, too. Knowing that we will make mistakes, but being brave enough to keep going, stumble through our blunders, make fun of ourselves a little. That's a really positive mindset to share with our students.
Brantley is so cool.
So cool. And she told us a little more about how she got to where she is.
Dwight is a great place for allowing people who really have no business being heads of school or teachers doing their thing. I come from a really non-traditional pathway. I was not a natural pick for, let's say, a traditional school as a school leader. But because I got the school started in China for them, Dwight gave me the opportunity to run it. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. I think the entrepreneurial mindset and the innovative mindset is very beaten out of so many schools. And Dwight has been able to stay agile in that way. And for a 150-year-old institution, that's not easy. And I point to kind of our leadership. For me, I'm always looking for a school where I'm going to get the key ingredients to make me happy. And that's autonomy, trust, and the ability to create and to do new things and just not be stuck in a rut. And so Dwight has provided all of that for me.
Yeah, it sounds like a great place to be. I love that you've brought up this non-traditional pathway to being in education. It doesn't have to be so cookie cutter, and I think we do a disservice to the industry when we expect teachers to all come from the same background.
You know, it's interesting, this point about non-traditional pathways, because you and I have discussed before how important we think at least some formal training is. Remember in episode, what was it called?
Episode 17, the benefits of formal TESOL training.
Oh, yeah. We kind of problematized in that episode the backpacker teacher, how teaching English is considered a holiday for some, especially English teachers from Western countries. And while teaching and traveling abroad can be a lot of fun, that dedication to improving your craft that comes out of formal teacher education, it's important not to do your students a disservice. But there's a distinction here with what Brantley is saying.
Yeah, that diversity of perspective that comes from different professional backgrounds can really shake up the way education has traditionally been done. And the key here is that Brantley is totally dedicated to the teaching craft, totally dedicated to making these schools as enriching and culturally sensitive as can be.
And her and other teachers and administrators' energy and motivation are really what keep Dwight Schools fresh. But what about tangible strategies for developing students' global citizenship?
Let's bring us home then to, the classroom. How can teachers all over the world infuse this notion of global citizenship, or even just more of a global perspective in their classrooms? What other strategies can you offer as an entry point for teachers who are just starting to open up to this idea of global citizenship?
One is you're trying to avoid kind of echo chambers or groupthink. So I think at the very basic level, when you start your your term and you're establishing norms, you really need to pull students to be creating norms that create the space to have that dialogue. Because if the students don't feel safe or secure with each other in terms of their ability to share ideas without being called out or shamed, you can't have a starting point for different points of view. And you've already used the term that I think is critical, and that's perspectives. And even if a teacher themselves doesn't feel comfortable providing an alternative perspective, constantly eliciting or working to pause and take that time for students to share potential alternative perspectives already is moving towards space for that global citizenship. What it is not is flags and festivals, right? It is not.
Thank you for saying that. Yes.
Right. It is not how we decorate our room in a way that, we need to honor culture, even just the culture within the classroom, understanding people's backgrounds and where they're from and what perspectives they bring, and use anonymous tools. I mean, if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that technology can help us shake things up a little bit. There's so many great spaces. If you're Google Suite School and you use Jamboard, you can be anonymous. If you're Padlet, you can use all of these tools to do contributions in the class that are safe, that you can then discuss as a group. And so I think that just from both setting those norms to create that space and then also maybe using some technological tools that keep those students safe when they don't want to share out verbally. That's a starting point. And you can come back. What's so fun is to do something like a Jamboard at the beginning of the year, and you come back at the end and you realize how much more confident students are with their ideas and how much more they've developed the kind of identity around how they want to think. So definitely the teachers do not need to be experts in global mindedness. They just have to be open to where the students will lead you. I mean, you guys know if you have a class of 20 students, it's not like they all agree or have the same point of view. You just got to make sure that that can be engaged with.
And that can be kind of hard to create in some cases, especially because, in certain contexts, you end up with that groupthink, right? And so I love that you emphasize this sort of anonymity, using tech tools for anonymity, because that gives that permission to have a different opinion. It creates that safe space for different identities to emerge, different ideas to emerge. And that's wonderful. Yeah.
I would add one more tip, and that's just to harness the power of narrative and storytelling. And so when you need to step away from how you might feel, right? It can feel very intimidating to share one's point of view as oneself. But particularly through narrative, through role play, through trying to represent me. When I was in graduate school studying foreign policy in Chinese in China, I was sent to a negotiation seminar where I was playing State Department roles from other countries, and trying to argue their point on freedom of the seas or, other complicated topics. And that was really illuminating for me at, 21 years old to think, well, gosh, can I argue from another country's perspective? And that's kind of narrative storytelling, right? You today must tell the story of how somebody else sees this. And I think those are just daily activities that build that respect for thinking a little bit differently. And you both know as English teachers, right? Literature is the greatest place to do that of all. And so the texts that you select as well, in terms of, really reading texts for alternative viewpoints, and then thinking about ways to help your students recognize that even if those viewpoints can be uncomfortable, developing and understanding those characters can help be a stand-in for the same tools that we need in order to understand people and, from other places and different global challenges.
Discomfort is great. Yeah.
It was great that Brantley brought up role play. I'm such a huge fan of role play, and I know you are too, Anna. I'd say it's often underestimated as a tool in the English language classroom.
Yeah, as a language learning tool for building communicative competence, for empathy building and global citizenship.
All of the above and more. I mean, with the scenarios Brantley is talking about, foreign policy, that's very advanced, and we may not be working at that level with our students, but not only does that require some in-depth perspective taking and subtlety of language use, it also requires research skills, critical thinking, and those skills can be applied across different contexts, right?
Yeah. Brantley mentioned literature and storytelling as well. And if you listen to our previous episode, Culture Through Stories with Dustin from Sandman Stories Presents, we saw there just how wonderful storytelling is for introducing different cultures, finding similarities and differences between different people and viewpoints.
For example, coming back to role play, we might ask learners to take on perspectives of different characters in literature, really embody their persona and apply it to reenact a scene from a story, or even just a completely new scene. How would, say, Harry Potter and Hermione Granger have a conversation about their future class schedule?
Harry Potter on the brain.
I love Harry Potter, of course. But being able to embody their different personalities and perspectives is quite helpful in building perspective-taking skills.
And we can scale that up or down to fit learners' levels. How would a conversation between Eeyore and Piglet go if they were planning a surprise party for Winnie the Pooh? And on the other end of the spectrum, how would the Prime Minister of Japan engage in debate with leaders of other G7 nations regarding climate change?
Right. And taking on the role of the Japanese Prime Minister wouldn't just come naturally to students, would it? There's a need for research, a need to examine how different cultures prefer to communicate in different contexts. Often, I'll create case studies with representatives from different cultural backgrounds, and students will then research dimensions, cultural or otherwise, that appear in the case study. How does communication strategy differ when cultures value direct communication? Or when what is left unsaid actually conveys a great deal of meaning. For students to participate in role plays and have some accuracy, these concepts need to be familiar to them.
There are just so many ways to go with role plays, whether it's a complex case study or a conversation between characters in a story or just a simple day-to-day exchange.
Yep. So before wrapping up, we wanted to give Brantley a chance to share one final thought. And she came back to some ideas on media literacy.
A critical part of this global citizenship piece is understanding misinformation, disinformation, and perspectives that are actually actively trying to manipulate us into certain points of view. I think that if we can do anything better in schools globally, it is teach understanding those critical areas, because it really does frighten me to think that we aren't helping young people learn how to decode and digest the information that is just flying at them and flying at all of us, frankly, right? The negative side of what we're talking about is that manipulation of young people's points of view. And so making sure that we're not only addressing, open your mind, take these ideas, sit with paradox, we're also saying, and we're going to give you the tools to ensure that you are not a victim of somebody's point of view that actually is really trying to do you harm.
Nice. It's interesting how it kind of all comes together in this concept of global citizenship, this critical thinking layer, cross-cultural communication, intercultural communicative competence, relationship building in the classroom, creating safe spaces for learning. There's so much that just falls under this umbrella. And I'm so glad that we had this conversation with you today, because I think conceptually for myself and maybe for our listeners, it's been a nice way to solidify a lot of thought processes that I've been having. And I think collectively as a podcast, Shey and I, we do a lot of this thinking together. So thank you for being a part of that process.
No, my pleasure.
You said it, Anna. This conversation really helped us solidify so much of our thinking in one giant nutshell, global citizenship. And we hope it's done the same for you, listeners.
So please tell us, what does global citizenship mean to you? And how do you infuse global citizenship into your curriculum?
You can share with us in a comment on social media or email us at teacherthinkaloud@gmail.com. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.